Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lon, and in each episode, I and a guest will unpack a trope with an eye for world building, character development, or narrative structures. You can also join the conversation on TikTok and Instagram. For those times when the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Okay, Brent, if you had to be a villain from any story, who
Oh
would you
man.
be, and what would be your evil plan?
Okay, does this include any story I've written? Because that's not fair. Um, Megamind.
Oh, okay. Why?
Um, okay, so I had never seen Megamind, and then my sister's boyfriend was like, "You remind me of Megamind." I'm like, "That feels like an insult." So I watched it, and it's not. Uh, he's he's a great dude. Um, but I don't know if I could pick an evil plan. I think that my evil plan would okay. Evil plan is kind of akin to Shigaraki's from My Hero Academia.
Okay.
Um, his whole thing, this is going to get me in so much trouble. His whole intention is to destroy everything, to tear down the world, right? Um, and I feel like that's kind of where I would be. And it's like it comes from this place of it can only get better if we break it down,
Hmm.
right? Um, so it's even then, it's not an evil plan. It's just a plan that kind of has to suck for things to get better. Um, I don't know. That's my
The
cop out.
ultimate complex villain, right? That's how you know you've got a
Exactly.
good one. Yeah, a
Yeah,
relatable purpose behind the
right.
evil. All right, Brent, thank you so much for joining me on
Sure.
Speculative Sandbox today. I'm really excited to dive into this topic. First, though, can you introduce yourself and share your latest projects?
Yeah, so I'm Brent Miller. I've been an author since I was 13. I wrote my first book and then published at 16. And I've come a long way since then, obviously. Um, but I went to school for engineering and medicine, biomedical engineering, and so I kind of try to weave everything into my stories. The most recent thing that I'm working on is called Faultless. It's the third book in my Powerless series, and it actually comes out in less than a month. So I have been editing like a madman, just trying to get that ready. Um, and then I have another series called Curse, but that one is all out, so it's more just shopping it out, I guess.
Yeah. So, because we record ahead of time, what is the release date of your current book?
Oh, right. I don't actually have a solid release date. What I have promised my readers is it will be ready to have on your shelves by Christmas.
Ooh,
Um, so that means I need to have it out a couple weeks before. Tentatively, I'm looking at December 9th, but I'm hoping to actually just move it in because that's the beauty of self-publish is I
yeah.
can I can say like, hey guys, I had it ready. So here you go. Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I feel like people are really understanding about the interesting obstacles that indie authors have to face, whether
right.
it's their printer has a delay, you know.
Yeah. Well,
So,
yeah, and that's why because I've gotten books in 2 days. I mean, not really. Okay, let's say a week to be reasonable, and it's taken months, and I don't know why. So that's why I'm trying to give as much time before Christmas as I can, so that I can make sure that if you want it, it'll be there, so you can wrap it.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I don't want to give too late of a date because if I can move it in, I will. But
sounds like a plan. Okay, so today we're talking. This is a very interesting topic, first and foremost. I think we're taking an angle that's a little different than when we kind of break down specific tropes for episodes. And you came to me with this kind of thesis, essentially. And in celebration of tropes in general, I played around with my background and the cover art, and I'm leaning into the fantasy defender trope.
I like it.
Um, yeah, but before I start asking questions about this, what is your favorite trope?
I'm partial to the hero's journey in general. I love seeing someone become something greater than they ever thought they could be, right? Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay. So let's take a 10,000 foot view. What
Okay.
are tropes?
That is a question, to be completely honest with you, that I don't think I still don't understand, and I don't think that I had anywhere near the understanding that I thought I did when I started talking to you, right?
Hmm.
Because the way that I have seen tropes has been almost akin to cliches, and also um, like if you go on tvtropes.com, right?
Hmm.
And it's like, okay, so I looked up just for, because my point is kind of everything's a trope, which I think still stands, but to a limit. But you go on tvtropes.com and it's like look up Goku and it's like Big Eater. Like Big Eater's a trope. And it's just like Goku just likes food. I don't understand, you know? Um, and so yeah, from my perspective, a trope um is kind of it's like a Lego piece, right? But if you build a beautiful Hogwarts castle out of Legos, every single thing in it is a piece. And
Hmm.
that's kind of how I see tropes is that you're not going to get away from them. You're not going to write a story like if I build that castle and I use um mega blocks instead, right? I try to make something else fit. It's not it's not the creation, right? I mean, um, you're not going to get away from those building blocks, is I guess kind of what I am talking in circles around. But I'd love to hear what you think or, how you define it too, because you're kind of the expert in this matter from my perspective.
Yeah, I also see building blocks. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about storytelling is you could present a synopsis, right? People do it
Hmm.
as part of like, when they used to pitch
Sure.
I don't know if they still do them anymore, but on Twitter and such. And you could take 10 authors, give them the same one sentence pitch and say, write this in your own way, and they'll
Hmm.
take those Lego pieces and they'll arrange it the way they want, and each one will have an individual storyteller. Hits the same,
Yeah.
you know, plot points and stuff like that. And some authors might end up being more similar than others just because, that happens. You can also look at movies and they can be completely different movies, but recognize the similar plot points between them. But
Right.
the overall package has its unique flavoring. I 100% agree with you that tropes are the building blocks of storytelling. But you mentioned the word cliche. And
Mhm.
so I think this kind of enters the realm in which I think when you first reached out to me, you were interested in talking about, which is the discourse that you see and what
Mhm.
people's attitudes are about tropes.
Right.
So tell me, what are cliches?
Yeah. So, um, cliche is, and I looked this up because I was like, what is the difference? And the idea is like cliche is overused, and so some people I think start to think, and maybe you see a trope a lot and you think this is cliche now, right? But that's the line is just for me, a cliche has to be overused, but I also kind of think that it has less depth and less reason, I guess.
Mm, okay.
That is pure not conjecture, but that's just purely how I see things. Um, but like the other thing that I might have mentioned this to you in my original like kind of thesis pitch statement, right? But there's uh so I'm a Christian, and I relate a lot of things, if not everything, back to the Bible. And there's a verse in Ecclesiastes that says there is nothing new under the sun. And
Mm,
that's how I see things. It's like every story that you will ever read, if you break down enough, it's been written before, right?
hmm.
And so, anyway, this is a roundabout way to answer what are cliches, but genuinely, the answer is I don't, I don't know, right? Um, yeah,
You know it when you see it. It
right,
feels cliche because I think what happens is if you see a certain execution of a trope that feels shallow,
yeah,
doesn't have a lot of depth, then you can start saying, "Oh, that feels very cliche." And then
yeah,
people start sharing their opinions of how they feel about said
right.
tropes and whether or not they think it's old or new or.
Yeah, and I think that you said it a great way that it's if it if it's an execution that you've seen a bunch of times, right? But I think the execution of the trope is the important part. It's not like, oh, I've seen a wise mentor before. Like, yeah, so have I, man. I've got so many of them in my life, right?
Yeah.
But it's like um if I'm watching Star Wars and I'm like, oh, before the movie starts, I can tell you this character's gonna die and this is gonna happen because one, two, and three are just four, five, and six. Like,
Hmm.
and that's where for me that line kind of starts to be of like surprising doesn't equal good. A lot of times people think it does, but I do like to have a little bit of surprise. And if I sit down for the film or I open the book and I'm like, okay, this is the plot, you know,
Hmm.
that's where I think cliche starts to kind of come in.
Let's say someone sits down and they want to write a story, and their
Yeah.
perception of tropes is such that they're like, I'm going to write a book with no tropes. Is
Yeah.
that possible?
So I would argue no, for the main reason being because that's a trope, right? To like it's actively a trope to sit down and try so hard to avoid tropes. And that's kind of what I mean when I say that there's no getting around it, right? Because um in one of my stories in Powerless, there's this note of the main character doesn't have a power and everyone else does. Well, that's a trope. But if the
Hmm.
main character has a power and nobody else does, well, that's a trope. If the main character is the weakest trope. And it's like, okay, so anything I flip, it's
Hmm.
it can all be broken down, but it's okay, right? Um, so yeah, my short answer, I talk a lot. My
No,
short
you're fine.
answer would be no, I don't think it's possible. And if you try too hard, you're only gonna kill your own story for it.
Mm, yeah. Okay, so you mentioned to me when you first reached out that you see the word trope getting a bad rap. Can you
Yeah,
walk me through what you've been
yeah,
experiencing and why you think that's
yeah.
happening?
Yeah, and the main example I have of this is from one of my reviews. And I, I know authors are told don't read your reviews, and I don't want to come across as like whining, like, oh, I got a bad review. Like, but they used the word trope infested to just describe the novel. And it's like, you know what? That's an opinion, and I'm not trying to like I don't think it is, but but infested is the part that I have an issue with here, right? Because there's this connotation that having a trope is bad. Infested is not a good thing, right? And so that's the perception that I feel from just the conversations I've had is that it's this, if you let a trope into your story, it's a disease, right?
Hmm.
And I, yeah, anyway, so that's the perception that I've seen. And honestly, that's the perception I fought back against, and that's why I say things like, "Oh, tropes are dumb." But it's not that tropes are dumb; it's the fact that I'm getting kind of frustrated seeing everybody, not every, but everybody in my circles, right, start to take these tropes that exist for a reason and equate them with bad storytelling.
Mm.
And so I don't think tropes are bad. I think that if we're feeding into that mindset, that's a toxic kind of discourse to be having, and then people will distance themselves from good stories for no reason except that I've seen somebody write a character, or I've seen the chosen one before, right? That
Hmm.
doesn't mean Harry Potter's not good, right?
Yeah.
So,
Let's do a quick exercise. I'm doing this off the top of my head.
sure.
And I might have to edit depending on how much thinking time we have to take. What is a recent story, movie? We can do movies, Netflix, something accessible and easy that people think is really original or fun, creative, or has made an impact. I guess I'll throw out one. It's the Wild Robot. It's
Okay,
huge right now,
sure,
right? But it's a family movie, and so it's kind of sometimes easier to pick out the tropes in there. So
sure.
you have found family,
Mhm.
adopted motherhood. You have the child that is an outsider. Um, you have the fox that is known for being a trickster. I don't know if have you seen it, by the way?
I haven't. So I'm just like learning
You're
the
like, yes, yes, these are all.
Really? Yeah, I believe you from the trailers alone. I'm like, no, this makes sense. My first thought when I saw it was, is this Wally? Like,
Oh,
uh,
yeah,
I haven't seen the movie, but I'm
that's
watching
fine.
the trailer and I'm like, dude, I like it. It's
Yes.
Wally.
There is a movie out that a lot of people talk about. It's the one, it was on Netflix, and it's about a guy, the actor Barry. Let me look this up. Barry Cogan, the Irish actor. Let's pull it up. It is Saltburn. Okay, so have
Okay,
you heard of Saltburn at all?
I have not.
Okay. That one got pretty big with like the Gen Zers, and it's
Sure.
about a boy, a young man, who infiltrates a wealthy family to then kill them all off, and then he takes over. So I probably should have said spoilers.
That's all good.
Sorry for everyone there. But that in itself, like people were like so sensationalized by all the
Yeah,
things that they were seeing. And I was like, but there's tropes in that too. You have
yeah.
the person that's kind of, you can consider it a County Monte Cristo where someone is getting revenge on a social class that
Mhm.
they think has like that are bad, basically, right? And he's trying to get revenge on them. Or you just have like it's the idea that's consistent with Parasite, which was that one movie about a low-income family that invades the house of a
Mhm.
wealthy family. So those are also existing tropes. So even then, like it's a great movie, people really like it, but you can even break those down.
Yeah, and that's all that's my point too, right? Is like I can make a reductionist view of anything. Like I've seen the meme going around recently that's saying that Harry Potter is just Star Wars.
Mm,
Um, and it's like, okay, look, there's a orphan child who's picked up by a wise mentor and taught, magic or the Force. And like so they break it down and it's like, sure, but they're completely different stories.
hmm
They're like to discount, for example, Ron from Harry Potter doesn't make sense. But yeah, sure, I can break anything down, right? Um, but yeah, and it's like you said, like these movies that you're pointing out are good movies. People are enjoying them, but that's always been my concern when I hear people say the word trope, is that they're going to take this view of, hey, um, the wild robot has found family. That makes it trope infested, and I'm never going to watch it. And it's like, but you're robbing yourself from a story that could be very good.
hmm
But
Yeah, absolutely. The Wild Robot, I think people felt emotionally impacted because it covers topics like saying goodbye to somebody, right? So
yeah,
you basically have a motherly robot and she's raised a child and the child now has to grow up and you release them out into the wild and
mhm,
that's a very relatable experience that we all have. I mean, you can take these same tropes and you can fundamentally connect them to real life experiences like you
right,
said. It's the human relation, you know?
exactly. And that's something I might be jumping ahead a little in the notes that you sent me, but that's something that I think is really important is that tropes exist because we exist, right? Like
Mhm.
they're all even the hero's journey is really a fundamental like thing that we've seen in real life and that at least coming from a male perspective that we all want. This is my dream. I want to be that guy, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's taking these things that if we can't directly relate to because we've experienced, we can relate to because it's this pull on our heart that we all experience, we all feel. And like, so tropes come from people, right?
Mhm. All right, so moving on to we've established that tropes are the human condition, basically. So let's take a leap back into time and talk about our human origins and tropes in ancient civilizations.
Mhm.
So looking at some of our earliest tropes, you talked about hero's journey. You have hero's journey in the Odyssey, in the
Yeah.
Epic of Gilgamesh. What are some other tropes that you see in ancient times?
Um, oh man. I I don't have I don't have a list that I can't steal from you. But
You're welcome to
I
steal
have
from me. Go
some
ahead.
yeah. Um I think that the one that really like stands out to me is the wise mentor. Um,
Hmm.
so like you mentioned Merlin, in the notes, like that kind of that trope exists all throughout history and all throughout stories, um, and of course I'm blanking, but I'm reading a lot of like mythology, so
Hmm.
Norse and Greek mythology, and everybody has the raven that teaches them, and there's always this voice. Um, but like the reason that one stands out to me is because I have that in my life, right? Like my martial arts instructor is a very wise man, and his input means a lot to me, and it's like so the trope again reflects life. Um, but then another one, because you mentioned earlier the fox and wild robot, right? Like tricksters.
Hmm.
And Loki is a big one. Um, so he's the whole trickster god, right? And so it's like, okay, but in Japan they have kitsune, which kitsune, to my understanding, are not quite as malicious as
Mm.
Loki, but they're tricksters. They
Yeah.
um and so we see it in um, Nordic religion and in Japan. And these are two cultures that, to my knowledge, and I am not a historian, are very much disconnected, right? Um, but we see the same tropes arising.
Hmm. Yeah, it's always really fun to kind of see how a lot of our most fundamental tropes were established in these ancient texts,
Mhm.
like the Odyssey, because then it continues to influence the stories into today. The Chosen One, I always find interesting because I've talked about how the Chosen One can be someone who is chosen to answer the call for good. So, jumping into Christian history, right? Moses was called
Mhm.
to do to what first you're gonna have yeah to lead the people, right? The lead
Mhm.
the Jewish people.
Yeah,
I gotta get my figures straight in my
you're
head.
good.
And then jumping over, you got Hercules in Greek mythology,
Right.
chosen capabilities chosen by birth, I believe, because he was a half god, which enabled him to have this heightened sense
Mhm.
of responsibility. But a lot of villains think they're chosen too,
Right.
right? So in the Avengers, you have oh my God, blanking purple guy. Why am I
Thanos.
blanking on his? Yeah, do you know the villain? I
Thanos.
Thank you, Thanos.
You're welcome. Yeah.
I just watched the movie last week. Thanos thinks he's chosen to snap his fingers and take out half people because that's his calling. And so I
Right.
think it's really interesting that when you take the chosen one, you insert the main character's perspective, throw in a mentor that either helps or hurts them,
Mhm.
and that can really determine the path that they go under.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really interesting. Um, There's a couple of things like, so you mentioned Moses, and the interesting thing for me with him is that that's also kind of a hero's journey with you get the call, you say, no, thank you. You get the call anyway, you know.
Yep.
Um, but then you also have like, okay, I relate everything to manga, just
Hmm.
that's what I read. But the chosen one, like Shigaraki, I mentioned earlier, Shigaraki is chosen. Like in the same way that All Might chooses Deku, the hero of the story, All for One, the villain, chooses Shigaraki to be his next, like his successor. So if you took Tomura Shigaraki and you made it from his perspective, now it's about a chosen one who was brought up by a wise mentor to tear down the bad parts of society. Like, it's actually, this story could be told from his perspective in a way that makes him the hero. And I just think that's so interesting. Like, that's a plug for my hero, but it's also a cool way that you mentioned that tropes can be from both sides, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of sitting on the hero's journey for a minute
Yeah.
here. Because a fundamental part of the hero's journey is that you have the call to action and you kind of don't answer it right away. You got to think and
Yeah.
consider it, and then something compels you, whether it's like a personal, conflict or motive, and then you undergo. And I think what's most important is that marks the start of a transformation. It's not a
Mhm.
transformation unless there's some hesitancy to change your world. But let's say that you write a story and you're like, I don't like that trope. I'm not going to write any tropes. I am going to make it so the call to action, I'm just going to go do it.
Right.
I don't have that hesitancy. What does that do?
Mhm. No, to me, like, I guess that would be subversion of the hero's journey. And I don't know, like, some, I'm sure if I found a master list of tropes, then there is something along, like, akin to, 'cause we've got reluctant hero, right?
Hmm.
So I'm sure there's something akin to eager hero who's like, I got this, you know?
Yeah.
Um, but either way, to me personally, I would just see it as a spin on the hero's journey, right? Like, rather than saying there's no trope, it's like, okay, so you took out an element of it, and that's okay if your character, for me, like, if your character is brash and like kind of just a go-getter, if your character is Cora instead of Aang, right? Um, then it's fine for them to just race into action. But if your character is Aang, if they are the reluctant person, but you decide they're going to immediately accept the call just so you don't do the trope, now the story suffers because your character just made a choice that doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah. That
Yeah,
it's interesting too because I feel like when you're right, subverting tropes, finding yourself in a different interpretation of said trope, or in this case, an opportunity to move into a different one, a different trope entirely. So the idea that a hero is kind of second guessing themselves is a human trait, a relatable trait. It
mhm.
humbles, right? And it's a
Yeah,
good building block for a good person. That's how we're translating it into the story. But when we think about people who are very confident in their abilities to do things, does that mean there are blind spots, right? And
right.
are those blind spots more relevant to an anti-hero or a villain trope?
Yeah. That's a really good point because like as you were talking about it, the first person who comes to mind for me is Homelander.
Okay,
Like,
yes, yes.
right? This I'm the hero. I can save everyone and I'm confident I'm do. But it's like, well, but maybe you shouldn't be, right? Um, and so for just in my experience from what I've seen, it does feel like that super overconfidence and like the lack of humility kind of lends to an anti-hero um at best, you know.
Mhm.
I'm sure it can be done because I'm a big advocate of saying, you know, a story can be told, and if you do it well, it'll be good, right? But so I'm sure that there are characters that I don't know who are good, but are also that confident. But yeah, to me, it feels like it will just lead you to not see your own weaknesses, um, which could lead to a lot of pitfalls, whether they're moral or physical. Like, you know, the hero loses somebody because they didn't think that they could cause any problem, right?
Mhm.
Um,
I'm glad you brought up The Boys. That is a great example of subverting tropes
right.
and like present like, a trope that's presented one way, inverting it and showing you that it's actually this way.
Yeah.
It's a really great exercise because it also examines how we view these tropes and have absorbed them into our own lives and what we may think is a charismatic leader that seems highly competent. You might think on paper that's a really good thing, but actually there's some issues with that, and it's nice to explore.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, then this is a perfect segue into the next portion of this topic, which is cultural and societal implications of certain tropes. All right, this is a big one. So, what are your thoughts on that, first and foremost, of the cultural and social ties to tropes? We talked about this already with humanization, but would you like to
Yeah.
go any further with that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that one thing that's interesting is that culture, so like I mentioned that we see tricksters in completely isolated cultures, right? But then there are tropes that, I can't name, but I'm sure exist that we can see in things like Greek mythology, with a kind of a polytheistic stance and approach, would have a different take and different things feeding into their stories than um, people with, Christian influences and a monotheism. And we can see, I'm sure, that different cultures will feed into that differently.
Hmm.
Um, so it's interesting to see where the ties are and where the differences are, right?
You mentioned manga, and I think speaking to Japan and the atomic bombs and how that's had a lasting impact on their storytelling.
Yeah,
So, obviously, like, well, now I'm gonna get my monster movies mixed up. Is it King Kong, or is it no? That's the gorilla.
Godzilla.
Godzilla, thank you. Godzilla and how Godzilla is, a large mass of land and destruction, right?
Uh-huh.
Societal destruction.
Yeah.
And then you have my kids love Suzume right now, which is an anime that's on Netflix, and it's about a girl that has to shut down these doors to a separate alternate universe because things come in and start like just destroying the world. It has a very much like
Yeah.
there's a lot of things destroying Japan,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Even I keep going back to my hero. That is, it's possibly like my favorite of any video game, movie, like book, any story, you know. Um uh, aside from like the actual Bible, that's probably my favorite story. Um, but anyway, even Shigaraki, his quirk, his special ability is destruction. He touches something and it decays.
Hmm.
Um, and he gets to a point where he's so strong that he can touch the ground and it spreads for miles and just absolutely decimates Japan. And it's like, I wouldn't have placed that as kind of going back to that, but I'm sure that it's in their minds when they're writing it, right? You don't forget something like that. Like,
Yeah. Can you think of any problematic or harmful tropes? And I can give an
yeah,
example. So for me, growing up in the 90s, a lot of tropes hinged, and even earlier,
yeah,
but I grew up in the 90s, uh, what hinged on the damsel in distress.
yeah,
So this idea that women cannot say need to be saved or cannot save themselves, and I think those things have an impression. They leave an impression, and I've
right.
noticed that as media has moved towards women in stronger, more independent roles, that attitude has also kind of reflected in the real world, the ability that you or can be, you can have that authority over yourself. So, uh, what do you think are some problematic or harmful
Yeah,
tropes?
yeah. I think that it's so for me, I think that the trope in itself is not inherently problematic, but it comes to the execution. Um, and I do understand what you're saying that like um, the damsel in distress is, I think people say women in refrigerator is one.
Yes, the fridge, yeah, the fridge trope.
Yeah, like, um, and so I struggle with that because on the one hand, I don't want to like give this impression that we should never write a damsel in distress. That is,
Mhm.
it's not okay. And if you ever have a story that shows a woman who needs the help of a man, you are doing a disservice to society, right? Like that feels like such a
Mhm.
strong stance. On the other hand, you don't want every story that children see that, to be taking in this. I mean, damsel in distress is harmful for women. That part's obvious, but it's also harmful for men, right? Like if if you're teaching boys you exist to save the woman, right? Then
Mhm.
you get a lot of kind of dysphoria and stuff going on.
That's an excellent point. The idea that you're being taught that you are responsible for another person
Right.
first, or that is your only function.
Hmm.
Um, that's a great point. What something I'm also kind of wondering about is it seems like, given the atmosphere of today, that it's getting harder to write morally gray character tropes.
Yeah.
And that's an example of just because there can be arguments for it being harmful, should it go away, right? Like,
Hmm.
so an episode ago or a couple episodes ago, I watched American Psycho. That guy is a terrible character. He's a bad villain, right? But
Right.
the idea is we all know, we should all know this,
Yeah. Like we expect that. It's there's no question of is he redeemable,
right?
right?
And the book is extremely offensive. It has, but that's because it's through the mind of a bad person.
Right.
I don't think that sort of stuff should go away, though. I think,
Right.
like we should be celebrating, um, different storytelling and methods. And there was a time for a couple decades where the morally gray character was the hot thing to do
Yeah.
in writing and storytelling. And now I'm noticing like it's more difficult to explore the morally gray character because some people may not understand that maybe that's the reason why you're doing it and not necessarily
Yeah.
endorsing what the morally gray character is doing.
Right. Yeah. That's something that I have thought about a lot as I write is, you know, I get concerned that people will not understand why I'm writing a character or why like these people are making this action or doing this action. And I'm like, I'm not I'm not supporting every decision every
Right.
character
You're
makes.
not the villain.
Yeah, it's like um but I think that it's it's kind of the responsibility of storytellers. Like it's a heavy burden that I place on myself, but at the end of the day, in 1,000 years, maybe, and I'm not sitting here trying to be like, oh, I'm going to be the next Homer, right?
Hmm.
But maybe one of my books survives and somebody's reading it, and I don't want it to just be empty. Like it's our job to express what is wrong with our society, with our culture, and like how we think we should fix it, right? And that's part of why I love my hero so much. But it's also, oh man, I had a really I wrote notes. So like some classics we have, right? Brave New World is one of my favorite books of all time. And I don't like reading it. It was not written in a style that I enjoy, right? But the concepts are so applicable to today. And Huxley wrote this as a way to, as a caution of like, no, this is where I see the future going. And I think that's our job. So if we restrict writing characters that are morally gray, or if we restrict certain tropes or things that are a present issue in our society, then how do we address them,
Mm,
right?
yeah, I think that was very well said. Sometimes we have to examine the things that we don't like to
Right.
better serve our future, basically. So, with that being said, as society continues to evolve, how do you see storytelling and tropes evolving with it?
Yeah. One thing that I foresee is a lot of AI, right? Um,
Hmm. Okay,
because
yes.
like we're already seeing AI and robots, and these are things, tropes that an ancient Greek storyteller would never have dreamt of, right? Like,
Hmm.
because yeah, it's metal people. But I was talking to my brother about this the other day, and I actually think it's um, interesting is did anything change? Because Skynet is, this big AI overlord that is destroying humanity, and right? But 200 years before that, could it not have just been aliens, right?
Mm.
And again, not to be the reductionist that I was scolding earlier, but is it that different if the aliens invade, take over, and enslave humanity, or if the robots do it? Like it still kind of gets to that same fear that we hold.
Yes.
Um, so my guess, if I, were to posit a theory for the future, is that I don't think we'll see new things develop, new tropes, but kind of these core things that we all relate to, that we all hold dear, they're going to persist, but the form will change to fit what they're experiencing, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's because ultimately tropes come through the human experience and how we are perceiving our realities. And so we could introduce aliens could literally drop down and now we've got aliens living on our planet and
Right.
we'll still tell stories where the application is the same, just different dressing, like you said.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've talked about what tropes are, where tropes originated, how tropes are evolving, let's talk about how tropes affect us today as writers. So, specifically, marketability, social media virality. Do you feel like authors have a lot more to think about as far as the marketability of their books? And do you think that sometimes you can feel backed into a corner with what you can do?
Yeah. So I, okay, I personally don't. Um, but I do think that it's a very real concern. But it can go either way. I know an author, and what she does is she puts all the tropes. She's like, found family, love triangle, whatever it is, and uses that to market the books, right? And then if you're like, oh, I like found family stories, then you know which one to pick, right?
Hmm.
Um, but then you can have, I think that the amount of people who will well, I'm kind of contradicting myself in my own head because I'm like, the amount of people who will immediately reject a book because of a trope is probably not as high as I originally thought. But I know me personally, if you tell me there's a love triangle in a book, I will not, I'm not interested anymore, right? Um, that's not because the trope's bad. I have never seen it done in a way that I liked. Um, that's also why I'm going to write a book with a love triangle that is done in a way that I like. It challenges me to step forward, right? Um,
Do you think that by listing those tropes, people are coming to it their own assumptions about what
mhm.
those tropes might represent, and
Yeah,
they might actually miss out on other aspects of the book they may not have otherwise thought about?
I think so. Personally, I think that people are if you're hyper focused on finding what's the same, you'll have trouble appreciating what's different.
Hmm.
And again, that's not to say always and every time, but I think that that's a trend that I would at least caution, you know.
I also think there's a lot of I'm going into a controversial area now, where and I've only noticed this because I see a lot of authors and readers talking about this. It's when people use AI to content generate their book, and what they're doing is they're feeding in, I want to have
Mhm.
the love triangle and found family and the just one bed and the all these things. Okay,
Yeah,
regurgitate it and then publish it, and then they publish 100 books in a given
yeah,
year, and then people feel, and this might feed into what you see too online, like people
mhm,
get resentful that
yeah,
the building blocks are cliches in this
right.
case.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, AI is a tough one. I I try not to like say any super tough stance because I I know authors who use AI for outlines or for whatever, and yeah, so I don't want to come across as this holier than thou or as me like putting somebody down, but at the end of the day, I think AI is theft. The way that it's trained matters. And right now, it is trained on material that it's not getting paid for, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I'm pretty staunchly, is that a word? Yeah, against AI in general. Um, but I guess that aside, I I think that you're right that we will, if you're using it, you'll just kind of get these formulaic stories. Um, and I actually I did so I use ChatGPT. I'm not like, but not for writing. I use it for a D&D campaign. I was like, give me 10 character names. And so I think AI has uses. I just don't see it in art. Anyway, I guess D&D is art. I'm talking in circles. But um I used it and I was so impressed with it. So I was like, hey, tell me a story. Like, give me the summary of Powerless by Brent Miller, right? I wanted to see how well it did. My book is not publicly available, like for free, so it's not ChatGPT can't access it. So what it did was found my book on Amazon and it read the description and it wrote a summary of the book. It gave me the incorrect character names and things like that, but the summary was pretty close. And I'm like, that's weird. Um, but anyway, it
AI is a very weird place right now
yeah,
because the term AI used generally can lacks nuance because, like for instance, there's AI informed technology in medical fields,
yeah,
right? And you
yeah,
want those if it keeps you
right.
alive. But even now, I'm looking at Zoom, and AI companion is one of the features on the
Uh-huh.
Zoom, and I don't know what that is, but it's just handed
Yeah,
over to us. And in some industries, it's now part of best practices. They're pushing out conferences
yeah,
and workshops, and they're like, use the AI. You need to use it.
yeah,
Everyone's using it. If you don't use it, you're behind everyone else. And so, living in this world right now, it's very confusing. And
yeah,
it really depends on what information that you're exposed to at what time. Being active online in the writing community, I am aware of what the writing industry thinks and believes, what agents and editors and publishers think. But if I wasn't exposed to that, I can very easily see how you may make the mistake into thinking that
mhm.
it's definitely something that you could be using because of how prominent it is everywhere now.
Yeah,
You assume it's
right.
okay.
Yeah, it's everywhere. And like you said, I mean, I'm so my day job, I'm a project manager, and I've seen this trend of AI reads for slides for like cancer diagnosis. And a lot of companies are trying to move toward that. And that might not be a bad thing because it's quicker. And like, don't we want faster and more accurate, more consistent results for cancer diagnosis? So, like you said, yeah, there's nuance there that in some industries it's important, but I think in our industry, people are scared because like Kindle is releasing something that trains itself on stories in the Kindle library, and you tell it, I want a story with this type of main character and this, and it writes you an AI story. And that feels really wrong, but I'm not personally concerned that it's going to take our jobs or take over because AI will never have heart. And
Mhm.
and that kind of bringing everything back to tropes, right? The tropes are the building blocks, but they come from the heart of humanity, the things that we care about. And when we write a story, that is there. And if AI is just using the blocks, it will never have the feeling behind it.
Mhm.
So I don't think that it's going to get to this point where it outpaces us in art, of any form. But it, yeah,
I
it,
feel like art has always been and continues to be an act of rebellion,
yeah,
just in the freedom of creativity and expression. And as AI starts to be integrated into society in all these different ways, art continues to be an act of rebellion
right.
by writing it yourself and all that
Mhm.
stuff. So,
I no, I agree, and it's countercultural too, right? And it always has been. I think that's why dystopia is such a popular genre, which um, I have trouble distinguishing genre and trope because dystopia feels like a trope to me as well. But it's so popular because, like you said, it's rebellion. It's
yeah.
like it feeds into this, anti-government thing, but it's always been around.
All right, we're coming up on time. So,
Sure.
Brent, thank you so much for. I thought this was
Yeah.
a really interesting conversation. I had a lot of
Thank
fun.
you. Yeah.
How can authors find you?
Yes, so I'm on Amazon and my website, brentmillerbooks.com. Facebook's Brent Miller. So everything's just Brent Miller Books. Makes it pretty easy. So yeah, I'm online. I also, I mentioned this to you earlier and then forgot to say it, but I am trying to build up my YouTube presence. So I'm putting up, panels that I do and things and tips for authors. So yeah,
That's awesome. All right. Thank you, Brent, again for joining me this week. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. I'll be back next week with a new episode. I'll talk to y'all later. Bye.